You're listening to Contesting Wrestling Premium.
And the newest installment of the Hollywood Backlot Wrestling Film Club.
This is going to be a real first for premium listeners. One, this is going to be our first premium guest. This is the first guest who we are locking behind the paywall. And this was also going to be the first episode. I think our first episode of all Contesting Wrestling where what we watched was just an unmitigated joy for me. Because like everything else, it's always, I mean, let's be honest, because it's not wrestling. We didn't watch wrestling. And we watched a movie that was good in comparison to the previous films that we have covered, which have ranged from abysmally terrible to, I guess this is better than being assaulted physically.
The first one was not that.
Did you do The Wrestler? But you must have done Aronofsky's Wrestler.
We haven't done good movies. No,
so far we've done Hell Comes to Frogtown, starring Roddy Piper.
I'm familiar with Hell Comes to Frogtown. Okay.
And Surf's Up 2, the animated feature.
Love it.
Starring several wrestlers.
Which we thought was going to be a total train wreck and fun in that way, but it just turned out to be a subpar kids movie that like wasn't even fun to like shit on or anything. So
yeah, like it was okay. Yes. which is like in all media, okay is the least interesting stuff.
It's the most damning. Yeah.
So well, let's let Ben. So yeah, Ben, introduce our guest.
Okay, so first of all, today we're covering the 1991 Coen Brothers film Barton Fink, which is much better than okay. And our guest is also much better than okay. He is a professor of English at the Borough of Manhattan Community College. He is the author of, and I'm going to list all 4 books because the titles are all excellent. How to Read Superhero Comics and Why. Imaginary Biographies, Misreading the Lives of the Poets. The Future of Comics, The Future of Men, Matt Fraction's Casanova, and Aestheticism, Evil, Homosexuality, and Hannibal, If Oscar Wilde Ate People. I am extremely pleased to introduce Geoff Klock. Thank you for being on the Contesting Wrestling podcast, Geoff.
Thanks for having me. I love it. I'm so goddamn excited.
I need to read that 4th one, man. I fucking loved Hannibal.
Don't buy that book. I'll send you a PDF.
Oh, okay, all right, excellent.
It's like 2 of my books are $100 academic monographs designed to be sold not to people but to libraries. And my best work is this kind of thing. The books are what I do to get promotions. This is the actual work. The books are for the penguins, you know.
I studied music theory in college, and I have a number of musical texts that I spent entirely too much money on for the especially for the information I got out of them, which I could have found on the internet.
I think that attitude, Geoff, figures in a lot to what's going on in this film. And I think, like, you know, as someone who teaches in a public institution and who is interested in superheroes and what might be regarded as like lowbrow media or whatever, you know, for me as well, I used to teach at a public institution. Now I teach at the cheapest private institution in New York.
But also, let's be honest, there's barely a division between public and private anymore. I mean, because the private concerns have come in and eaten up a lot of what you would think of as the public education sector. So this is a specious distinction pretty quickly.
But yeah, I mean, but I think we're both people who, you know, are academics, but, you know, are much more comfortable speaking to a more public audience than an academic one in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So today we are watching Barton Fink by the Coen Brothers, a movie that I had not seen before. I love the Coen Brothers. I feel bad that I have not seen all of their films because often if pressed for what my favorite movie of all time is, once again, I'm not, as we were discussing before the podcast, I'm kind of bad at ranking things and I almost don't believe in it. But if pressed for my favorite movie, I will often say Miller's Crossing. because just for a lot of, if you've seen Miller's Crossing, you understand why. And the Coen brothers, now that we've been doing this podcast a while, I feel more comfortable making comparisons like this. I feel like the Coen brothers are like the Chris Jericho of filmmaking, where in the last, with the last few years, you're like, maybe they might pound for pound be the best. They might just maybe not the best, but like they've just have the highest hit ratio. They've been the best for the longest, where they just pretty much every movie they make is unbelievably fantastic, and they've been knocking it out of the park since the 80s, pretty consistently.
Yeah, they're really good.
I had seen this film before, but it was in the theater when I was 7 years old. My parents took me to see it.
What?
And I did not get much out of it, as you might have expected.
Right, exactly.
But I very much enjoyed it this time, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
I had often heard that this was the most surreal Coen Brothers film, the Coen Brothers film that most bordered on like Lynchian style, and I mean that seems fairly accurate, I would say.
Yeah, watching it, I'm like, these guys have at least seen Eraserhead, and so they've taken some of that influence in. As it's like an earlier movie, like in their catalog, you can definitely like. They're still paying tribute to the people that came before them as artists. Which, I thought the movie was great, so I don't want this phrase to be misconstrued, but if you're into that kind of thing, this is definitely the movie for you. Whereas, like, I don't know, I'm a big fan of, like, Lebowski, and at that point, not that you can't see their influences in it, but that's just them.
Sure.
They have completely hit their groove there, and they don't have, like, they don't have the Eraserhead-esque things. They got the quick fantasy sequence for 2 minutes, and then it's back to just bowling.
Geoff, let me just say, Geoff, you are, among other things, a scholar of David Lynch.
Yeah, that's one of my top three things.
I attended your lecture on Mulholland Drive, where you showed the film and talked about it,
The best
and I feel like that
lecture, by the way.
It's an incredible event that everyone should witness if it comes around ever again.
Also, I would say as a movie I like as much as Miller's Crossing. Yeah. I would say is up there. Yeah, definitely.
And I feel like having been through your analysis of Mulholland Drive really prepared me well for this film and helped me understand this film better than I would have without it.
And I feel like what this movie does that is really important if you're going to make like a strange surrealistic film that doesn't quite make sense is that you watch it and it could it could have an answer. Like I feel like I could go I had the urge to go on YouTube and be like watch like the explainer videos and see if it lined up with my own things, but it also doesn't need it. It also can just be what it is. Like part of why Mulholland Drive is so great is like Mulholland Drive is a movie that you can sit there and try to work out like where the puzzle pieces fit and what it all means and like what's the real story happening underneath. But you can also just let it wash over you like an experience and have it sort of play your emotions. And it doesn't matter what the quote-unquote real story is about because you just have a good time watching it and it makes you feel things.
Well, that's some of the hallmarks of just art, like good art. The person experiencing it will have a different experience than the person sitting next to them intaking the same art. And like regarding like, yeah, you could go and analyze the hell out of a movie like this and go to YouTube and see what everybody's takes are.
And Jeff will in just a moment.
Actually, can I interrupt Doc for a second?
Yeah.
You said something really important, and this is like a really crucial thing I think to seize on, is that the person sitting next to you can have a very different experience than the one you're having. I think it's also crucial to remember that a single person can have two contradictory, like those two people sitting next to each other having different responses can both be in your head. So I just want to...
I think...
Where on the graph can must and cannot... intersect.
Yes, the great robot monster. I think there's a specific scene towards the end of the movie where that really is like palatable. That dissonance in your attitudes towards what's going on, involving John Goodman. But
John Goodman's a treasure. But I think the point that I was about to make, and I think it's an important one, is that when this movie came out, it's like, what, 91?
Yep.
You know, you could not immediately go get 100 or 1,000 different takes on it. Even if you saw it in the theater in New York, like maybe you could talk to the other people who saw it, who were probably serious movie people at that point, or you could read the review in the Post, some old guy saying, "What the hell was that?" Or you could read the review in the Voice.
I was going to say,
glowing and probably didn't mention the movie at all during the review. So you really had to think about it yourself, which can be lost these days a little bit because of the overwhelming in-your-faceness of the review culture.
In an early form, in a pre-internet form of something that we all do on the internet now, which is specifically seek out infuriating opinions so we can get mad and experience that rush, and then later on be like, why do I do that? What's wrong with me? Why am I doing this? But in the moment, we totally are into it. I would often find a movie, see a movie that I really liked, and then go find a copy of the New York Press to read Armand White's reviews, because Armand White is in many ways is a pre-internet troll, a guy, but also it's very wrestling. Nobody has ever been able to figure out if Armand White is serious or not, right? Nobody's ever been able to figure out how real it these days. I'm lean towards he just is actually like that because he's just still fucking doing it. But it's if you don't know who I'm talking about, listeners, go find any of his reviews. Literally any of them. It's the man is a surgeon of human anger.
So, speaking of wrestling, given that this is a wrestling podcast, one might wonder why we watched this film, because it's not immediately apparent if you've just kind of heard of it, what the connection to wrestling is. So, by way of a little bit of plot details, I'm going to try to introduce those connections and some historical details that might shed light on what's going on a little bit. So, in the film, Barton Fink is this playwright in New York, and he's been somewhat successful. And he goes to Hollywood because maybe he'll make some money writing for the movies. And he says at one point, he doesn't really want to go to Hollywood because he's like, I really want to do this living theater that, captures the experience of the common man or something like that. And my immediate thought is, well, the common man watches movies, right? Not Broadway plays and wrestling, right? The common man watches wrestling. So he goes to Hollywood and he's charged by the head of the studio, Capitol Pictures, to make a wrestling film. And so I was really interested as soon as I saw that part. I was like, all right, I need to look up something about wrestling films so this movie takes place in 1941. Now, I knew a little bit about extremely early wrestling films. In the late 19th century, some of the earliest films were films of wrestling matches. And this was when they were probably more legitimate contests, though there's still some question about that. And going into the first decade of the 20th century, there were films made of wrestling matches and also reproductions of great wrestling matches that hadn't been filmed, with actors standing in for the wrestlers or different wrestlers standing in for the wrestlers. So the history of film and the history of wrestling is actually somewhat symbiotic. So a lot of the tropes, and when we get into what makes a wrestling film, and Audrey's scene in the film where she explains that, which I think is the crucial scene in the entire movie. That has a lot to do with the fact that wrestling as the tropes of wrestling developed hand in hand with the tropes of Hollywood films. Now, getting into the 30s, so the first big modern wrestling boom was in the 20s with the Goldust trio of Sandow, Mont, and Strangler Lewis, who sort of developed the basic conventions.
That's Ed the Strangler Lewis,
yes.
Not to be confused with Evan the Strangler Lewis.
Right.
who came before him. I believe I pointed that out on a very early episode of this podcast.
I'd
like to remind some people.
I was just about to ask you, is it based on Eugene Sandow? And then I remembered that I asked you that in like episode 2, and
Billy Sandow.
Billy Sandow. Well, no. I was asking if the wrestler Billy Sandow, if the name was at all connected to legendary strongman and early bodybuilding icon Eugene Sandow,
right. Which very well might be the case. So by the end of the 1920s, though, I think with the Depression and then the coming war, wrestling kind of took a dip. But I wasn't able to find a lot of information about it, but it seems like there were a lot of wrestling films in the early 1930s. Specifically, so in the film, the studio head wants Barton Fink to write a film for actor Wallace Beery, okay, who was a real actor, who was a big deal in the 1920s and 1930s. By the 1940s, he was already pretty old, which explains why the studio head is like, is he too old for a romantic interest? But Wallace Beery starred in a wrestling film in 1932 called Flesh. This film was co-written by an uncredited William Faulkner, who came to Hollywood to make money because he was broke and hated his experience there and wrote this fucking wrestling film. Holy shit!
And that has to be then the writer character in the movie.
W.P. Mayhew.
W.P. Mayhew.
Exactly. And to some degree, Fink himself.
Yes.
Who now is very obviously a caricature of William Faulkner, now that I think about it, where it's just like, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that blew my mind when I discovered it.
Now I want to hear Jeff's opinion on this. Jeff, what was your perception of this movie's relationship to wrestling as somebody who knows as much about wrestling as I did in episode 1 of this podcast?
Yeah, I don't have a good working knowledge of wrestling. I mean, to me, I just tossed it in there. In my mind, them asking him to do a wrestling picture, it would be like now them asking for a superhero movie. Or
sure.
Right, to me, it was any kind of like basic, simple, like she says, right? There's usually a good wrestler and a bad wrestler, and he has to protect a kid or a morality play, yeah. Right? I mean, this is what superhero movies are. I mean, in fact, I remember laughing really hard during Iron Man 3, where he has to protect not a dame but a kid. Just like, I remember sitting in the theater and being like, maybe like it's the same. Like so to me that was really my takeaway from it, except for the fact that there's so it could be any genre, I guess, some kind of whatever generic thing, except for the fact that towards the end of the movie they make this connection to, I want to see, it's about men in tights. We don't want to see someone wrestling with their soul. And it was that particular language. Wrestling feels really integral to the movie because, and I hate to say this, because of the phrase "wrestling with your soul," which and that also and it has these biblical resonances of like Jacob wrestling the angel and getting the name Israel, right? That from the Torah. Am I getting that name right? Is it Jacob? Probably Jacob.
Yeah, you're asking the wrong crowd.
The point is it's Jacob. It's Jacob wrestling the angel in the Bible, but also the idea of wrestling with your soul. That's part of the punchline that wouldn't be there if it was a superhero movie or a cowboy movie. Because we don't, you wouldn't say wrangling with your soul. That's not an expression.
Right.
I suppose not.
And I think part of the point there, and why it's, to me, it's about wrestling in general, why wrestling is there, is that wrestling in a way is, and to put it paradoxically, it's so literal that it's a metaphor for everything.
Yeah, agreed.
Right. So,
yeah.
So, what is, and I think part of the point of the movie is that all stories are basically reducible to this simplistic morality play of the good guy versus the bad guy. And that with wrestling, where it's actually like literally two bodies struggling for dominance, that represents any kind of struggle between ideals, between nations, between, anything. And that's why wrestling really, for me, and that's one of the reasons I love wrestling, is I feel like it's a distillation of narrative and of storytelling into its like most sort of like primal form.
The other thing I want to say about wrestling really quick is just I mentioned that like wrestling with your soul is a phrase, and it pops up literally in the movie as wrestling, a wrestling picture. But there's two other moments in Barton Fink where an English idiom is handled very literally. And one of them is "don't lose your head." And there are multiple references, right? It's absurd the number of times, don't want to lose my head. I can't trade my head in for a new one. The ball all balled up at the head office, where there's head, there's hope. The contents of your head are the property of Capitol Pictures. Let's keep our heads. Guy's funny in the head. And the other one is walk a mile in another man's shoes. Which is exactly what Barton Fink needs to do, to see something from someone else's perspective. And also, in a little joke, he literally puts on John Goodman's shoes and starts writing really well until John Goodman knocks on the door. So the movie is interested in literalizing idioms in that way.
And it also, to me, the most immediate or the most apparent like kind of meta theme of the movie that it had in common with wrestling is that it's a movie that is concerned with how to present authenticity and how like the process of creating something that is fictionalized that feels authentic, which if you don't know anything, like if you went in not knowing anything about wrestling, you could easily be like, oh, well, that's what movies are, right? Like movies are trying to present an all, but I feel like now with my knowledge of wrestling and knowing that it's like what makes wrestling interesting is that it is this blend of fictionalization and theater with like unreproducible authenticity, like with a kind of authenticity that just really can't come from even a great actor and a great filmmaker and a huge budget or something like that. And Barton himself is somebody who like. And this is also a movie about being a writer and procrastinating. But it's like Barton is somebody who, he is lauded for his authentic representation of the working man, but he is also completely uninterested in actually hearing anything about the working man, and
He is lauded for his representation of the working man by the caricatures of the New York upper class of the 40s, who also don't know anything about the working man.
It's 100% correct.
The kind of people who, at the end of the Depression, while most of the working men had already gone off to World War II, could go see Broadway shows.
And the most revealing moment, I feel like, of Barton's personality in the entire movie is when, because he has all of these, there's all these times throughout the movie, he's a very soft-spoken character. He's very low energy level, very like withdrawn. And the few times that he really comes out tends to be when he's going some rant about like the meaning of art and all this. And then at one point, John Goodman's just like, "Oh, like, do you know anything about wrestling?" He's like, "No, I don't really care to learn anything about the act itself." Is the term he uses, right. Which is there. That's everything you need to know. It's a guy who is really concerned with presenting authenticity, but also does not care about it in any meaningful way. Just his conception of it.
He also tends to get fired up when he's being super hypocritical, right? Like when he's talking shit about Mayhew and his drinking and all that. When, of course, as soon as he's offered a drink, and the way he treats Audrey and all that stuff, where he's just obviously trying to get in her pants and. And what he does is he continually plays out this kind of fantastical morality play between himself and Mayhew, between himself and the studio and all that stuff, and just like continue by trying to present himself as this great auteur, just falls into the same kind of hackneyed tropes that he would wants to avoid.
Like, I like at the end, towards the end of the film, when the studio head just explains blatantly what he wants, as though it was stupid that Barton didn't already know, because you're coming to write a script for a movie. We want wrestlers, action, boom, these guys are fighting, we have a winner and a loser, and people go home happy. But Barton actually only knows one thing, which is let me find the center of some tortured soul, and, but nobody really cares. That's the problem. Nobody really cares about that when it comes to doing what you do in a Hollywood movie, which is make the most money possible at the widest audience possible. It's not something he had to deal with before, but he did do it.
I sympathized with that as like a professor who, will assign something very simple. Like I want the students to just analyze a text and, just make it clear that they understood what they were reading. And like the brighter students tend to go off on these like rants about their own personal views on things without actually doing the thing that I asked for. And
I feel like there's a strong suggestion that it's like, the play that he is lauded for is, it's implied that it's basically his, like, either his life or like at least a life that he had firsthand experience of. Because he grew up on Fulton Street, and like he wrote this play about fishmongers, which that's who was on Fulton Street at the time, stuff. And I loved. There's a moment when he's been in there trying to write for. Time is very slippy in this movie, but you get the feeling that he's been in the hotel for some period of time trying to write, and we get a view of what he's written, and it's literally. It's like he's barely written anything out. He's added like 2 sentences to the thing he wrote at the very beginning. It's something he's written before because he's setting this movie on Fulton Street, and you hear fishmongers cry just like the play that he wrote. And then the next line is something like, "Oh, there's no traffic now, but like you'll probably hear traffic later." And it's just like it's such a 101 like hack writer thing that is like also a thing you have to unlearn as a fiction writer, to write about cool stuff that will happen later on down the road, or write about things that are going to happen later. It's like, no, write about what's happening right now in the scene.
Particularly in a film script, though, where his setting is we don't hear traffic, perhaps we will. Like, what does that mean? Like, no one's gonna read that. Like, my favorite stage direction in any play is from a Beckett play. And Samuel Beckett writes, he's describing the room, and he's like, there's a chair and there's a wall, and he writes, the door is imperceptibly ajar. Like, you mean closed? if it's imperceptible, like how you mean closed, right? The audience sees a closed door imperceptibly ajar.
Who are these directions for?
Like how is that even going to impact like the actor's performance at all? Like how is that a note that's going to inform?
How is the set designer supposed to communicate that the door is imperceptibly ajar?
I did have a note throughout all this, like watching like Barton like have all these fucking opinions but not do anything and just be kind of. I was like, if it was said in the modern day, Barton would be a podcaster.
Yeah. Oh, he would be a guy who's constantly saying he's going to start a podcast and what it's about and what he doesn't like about, he'd complain to you about Joe Rogan all day long, and I'd be there being like, I've never listened to the Joe Rogan podcast. And he's like, well, I've listened to every episode, and let me tell you what's wrong with it. And I'm like, I'd really rather you didn't. I'm not interested in listening to his podcast or his opinions. And he's like, he was so wrong last week. I really don't care, buddy, for about, 2 hours.
Now I do.
Can you tell I've met that guy before?
You're talking about me. I understand that you're talking about me. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
You'll complain about the Joe Rogan podcast for 10 minutes, and that's fine. It can be a personality type for some people.
I did feel like this is getting maybe a little too meta, that like this movie to some degree mirrored like some of the conflicts that we've been having over the podcast recently.
That's not too meta at all. That is actually 100% accurate. I don't really know where else to put this point, so I'll just say it here right now. There was one small issue I had throughout the whole script. There was one small thing. I bought everything. I bought the surrealness. I totally bought John Goodman as a serial killer, possibly a Nazi, possibly the devil, and possibly the last act of the movie is in hell, and that's totally a reasonable interpretation. I did not buy the studio executive being like, I respect your artistic intentions, and you don't have to tell me about the movie. That was the one thing that I was like, all right, guys, this is a little much for me to buy.
But it's
Come
part
on.
it's part of a pattern in the movie where every single time, like it's part of the pattern of the movie is just a constant reversal of expectations. So like when you expect him to get in trouble, they literally kiss his feet. When he turns in his masterpiece and they hate it. He tells him at the end of the movie that you broke Ben Geisler's heart. He loved you. Like, did he? Like that? Geisler
did not
seem
seem to.
Hated him. There's so many moments where just like you don't get what you think. Like Audrey's dead body. I think everybody is like, oh, it's a dream. And then you're like, oh no, it's not. Like it's kind of and then also has to do with like Charlie seems like a nice guy, and then he turns out to be a psychopath, right? And there's all these little fake outs like, oh, Barton's working really hard. Nope, that's the secretary typing in a different location.
Yeah, all the typing shots.
And yet, on that note about Charlie ending up being a psychopath and perhaps being the devil and a Nazi, so early in the film he calls himself a heel. Twice.
Yes, yeah. I noticed that.
He says,
yes.
I feel like a heel, which can't be coincidental, right? They have to realize that that's a crucial piece of wrestling terminology, right? And then, but in that scene where he shows up and he's the fucking devil and he's killing the cops, you can't help but root for him over the cops, right? And he is now the hero saving the like half-wit man-child, Barton.
And let me toss it. One of the reasons why the cops come off is, I mean, they're unsympathetic because they say to him, "Fink, that's Jewish, isn't it?" But it's also worth pointing out. I don't remember the last names of the cops off the top of my head, but one of the last names is German and one of the last names is Italian. So like it's crucial that World War II is about to start, and you have an Italian and a German guy being like, "Hey, are you Jewish?" Like, so they feel extra menacing in that regard.
And for how awful the cops' characters were. My God, that scene where they're interrogating him in the hotel lobby is just like that is grade A fucking Coen Brothers dialogue.
But
there. Like
with
that is. Normally we say that there's no useless information that you could give us, but that was actually useless information.
And it's a brilliant like scene while they're also like totally like hackneyed movie cops, right?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Oh yeah, they are caricature of bad cop number 1 and caricature of bad cop number 2, but they're supposed to be. Yeah, I think the thing that I liked most about this movie is that everyone in it is really good. That they all played their parts really well. And
Steve Buscemi,
the acting,
Steve Buscemi in his tiny role,
right? My name's Chet. This is before he was famous. This is before he was the waiter for 5 seconds in Pulp Fiction. He's great. And John Goodman is a national treasure and has been for decades and decades. I'd see him in anything.
I mean, yeah, everybody. John Turturro's amazing. Fucking Judi Davis is every movie she is ever in is fucking incredible. I grew up I loved Woody Allen movies when I was a kid. It was extremely inappropriate, and she's in like a ton of them, and is unbelievable in all of them. She's even in that. She's in that Netflix show Ratched that I don't want to watch because I think it's a dumb idea and I don't like Ryan Murphy very much as a writer, but the cast is like unfucking believable if you look at the cast of that. So I don't know, I might wind up watching it.
Speaking of Woody Allen, I think there might be as much of an influence of him in here as David Lynch as well. Like
it's the Nebuchadnezzar protagonist. It's really the neurotic writer who somehow this beautiful woman takes pity on, and just the only Woody Allen aspect missing is that she's too old.
Yeah, it was because the
Coen
brothers.
She would have been William Faulkner's daughter.
Right.
The Coen brothers are definitely the Mario to the Wario of Woody Allen, I think. Where it's like a lot of the same energies, but like nobody's marrying their stepdaughter.
By the way, Geoff, when we were talking about doing this episode, you mentioned that this film reminds you of Kafka, and I think especially the scenes with Audrey, right, are straight out of the trial.
Yes.
And the way that he encounters women that Kay encounters women there. And I think the idea of him being like coming to Hollywood with like not a clear idea of what his job is reminds me a lot of The Castle and The Land Surveyor and all that stuff.
Oh, and the scene where I like, especially just in terms of like the purposeful obfuscation of things and like purposefully confusing the main character, when the studio head is like, or not the studio head, when Tony Shalhoub is like, oh, we're gonna, you need to see some wrestling pictures. All right, I'll send you down to the screening room. And instead of showing him a movie, they show him the dailies from another wrestling movie, which, like, watching the dailies for a movie that's being shot now is going to give you nothing.
I will destroy you.
Yeah. And the other
he
the other
certainly
Kafka
wouldn't
thing,
like go see any wrestling.
I mean, the other Kafka thing too is just like he's alienated and alone in a world where nothing makes sense. You see this, by the way, also in Alice in Wonderland. It's the same formula. Is that someone is there are rules, but I don't understand what any of them are. And you're just because he's outside the circle of the rule makers, right? But also that the movie insists on dumping him lost at the end. Like that's the most Kafka thing is how radically lost he is at the end. I mean, I'm going to argue that actually he's gained some knowledge, but he's pretty unmoored from everything at that point. He has inner knowledge for the first time, but is completely, what happens next. He's in limbo. His scripts being owned by the studio that's a very Kafka-esque kind of limbo. You can write, but we'll never publish anything you write.
Well, and he's either like there's, like I said, there's an interpretation where, you could definitely say that like, oh, like at some point he's like murdered by John Goodman and he is now in hell and we're watching him. That's one interpretation. But there's also he is very much in the metaphorical hell that any writer would be in, where it's just like, oh, you have to keep writing for us forever and no one will ever see it.
Yeah.
It's never going to go out there, but you have to keep doing it for us.
Yeah.
I was going to, unless anybody had another point, I was going to ask, let's get to the either most fun or most stupidest question. Which is, what do you have a literal interpretation of this movie? Do you have a thing where you're like, this is what I think happened, and I think that we just saw a certain interpretation of it, but this is what I think happened?
You're asking me now, I assume, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm not asking these schmucks.
I mean, I do have a pretty strong sense of it. Although this is not probably what you're expecting, but it's there's like type of fan theory that is very prevalent in David Lynch studies or whatever.
I feel like I know already what you're going to say.
Yeah, which is that you treat art as like a code, and the job is to decode it or to solve it in some way. And the problem is that there are people who don't want to solve things. And they're just like, man, just like let it wash over you, the Jungian energies of the universe. I don't really get along with those people either. But there's another kind of person who's like, this is confusing. Confusing things make me angry. I want a solution, and then I can stop thinking about this thing. And I think it's neither chaos energies washing over us and it's meaningless, and anybody who tries to understand it is absurd. But it's also not John Goodman's the devil, and and Turturro's in hell, and right, like that's an attempt to solve something because you don't want to live with the mystery of it. Whereas I think I think the better way.
I just want to quickly point out that's not actually what I thought it was. That was just an interpretation I thought was possible. But yeah.
No, and here's I don't think you're wrong. I think the movie 100% suggests exactly what you said. It's just that it also suggests other possibilities, and they're all floating around. And I don't think we need to necessarily resolve it into one or the other. But your observation, I think, is completely correct. It's that it absolutely, of course, it feels like hell. The whole building's on fire, and it magically burns. My favorite, it burns as John Goodman walks. The hallway catches fire with every step. It's also stunning to watch this thing because I've been watching Lovecraft Country, which is quite good.
So fucking good.
But I gotta say, and this is, I'm showing my age here, and I am Norma Desmond. But like, CGI fire doesn't look right, and there's repeated CGI fire throughout Lovecraft Country, and it because there's a burning building that they walk out of, and like, holy shit, it was better in 1991. And I love CGI fire because it means no one gets hurt. And let's do that. But still, if I actually having watched a movie that's been made in the past, I got to say the fire in that Barton Fink scene is flawless. That scene looks so good, particularly because it's before CGI. Really
well, and getting into the whole idea of wrestling being about showcasing these like authentic things that an actor can't really reproduce, like the fear in John Turturro's eyes when he is surrounded by actual flames is very real. Like that is he is a great actor. He was not acting in that moment, I don't think. Like,
I mean, for me, like laying in bed after watching the film and having all the scenes flashing through my head and like trying to find the significance in all of them and put it all together, that's the fun.
Yes.
That's what the movie does for me, is give me that feeling that I want to understand it but can't really entirely.
So it's like it's kind of like getting this. I felt this movie is more it is more concrete than like a Lynch film, or but like, you know, like what Lynch's movies are great because it's like you get to watch somebody else's dream who's better at dreaming than you, and whose dreams are a little bit more, maybe have more of a a
logic to it. It has a type of logic. Right. It makes a kind of sense. Okay.
And sometimes I think it makes, like, maybe not a cognitive sense, but an emotive sense, right? It's supposed to make you feel a certain way. And that's the meaning of it, is not necessarily. But it kind of goes back to something that we said in an episode that hasn't come out yet, which is always weird. But, you know, I'm very comfortable in that hall of mirrors of pro wrestling where, you know, I don't know what's real and what isn't. And that's really fun.
Yeah.
And I think the sensation is similar to the one that you get from a film like this.
Yeah, and I think that is really the right way to think about what it's doing. Like my basic take on the movie, right, is that the very first thing you see in the movie is wallpaper, right? It's something that covers something else up. The whole point of wallpaper is to cover something. The second thing you see in the movie is backstage at a theater. This sets up a pattern that the movie repeats and repeats and repeats, which is there's the thing that covers something up, and then there's the thing on the other side of that thing, the thing you're not supposed to see, right? And I know the wallpaper, I'm mixing my metaphors with the wallpaper in the theater, the backstage of the theater, but the point is that the movie constantly gives you, here's a surface, and then goes, do you want to go on the other side of the surface? And Barton always wants to go on the other side. He wants to, because his whole ethos as a writer is he's plumbing the depths, right? He wants the truth, real truth of it. Rich people and their pretensions and artifice, he's got to plumb those. That's the life of the mind. He's got to have it.
Well, that kind of goes with him selecting that hotel. You know, the head of the studio was like, "Oh, we need to get you in a better hotel." And he's like, "No, I need, yeah, you can stay at my house. Oh, you don't want something so Hollywood." But it's part of the great folly of Barton's character. You know, he wants the dingy hotel because it's the common man experience. But no, it's not. And there's nothing really common about this hotel. And as much as he wants to plumb the depths of the experiences of the minds of regular people, as we already brought up, he has plenty of opportunity to do so on a practical level, but he's so into his own mind, he never does.
And when it comes to
go.
I was going to say, when it comes to storytelling, as I was suggesting at the beginning, like the meat of a story is really this conflict between like good and evil and between these like basic characters. It's wrestling. What's an artist, like an artistic writer or filmmaker, brings to the table that's interesting and sophisticated, that's the artifice. That's the window dressing.
Yeah.
So like the thing that he's really good at, and the studio head keeps saying, I want that Barton Fink feel, right? What that is not the depths. It's the surface.
Yeah.
Right.
This movie, the number of images of surface and depths, because for a lot of people, like, this movie is just full of random shit happening. But when you see that what they are essentially is variations on a theme, which is, here's the surface. Do you want to go on the other side of the surface? And some of them are in silly, stupid places. So like John Goodman has a tie, but then secretly on the other side of the tie, there's a naked girl. like,
and then there's the box,
and then there's the box, and the box is the most important. The box is the most important one. But on the way to the box, right, we've got William Faulkner. We I can't even call him William Faulkner. By the way, when he knocks on the door of the sort of bungalow room that William Faulkner is in, the movie William Faulkner is writing is called Slave Ship. The actual William Faulkner actually did work on a movie called Slave Ship, and guess who it starred? Wallace Beery. Like, the Coen brothers' attention to detail in this movie is insane.
By the way, what is the title of Fink's script? I didn't quite catch it.
Can I tell you? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I also
do they
don't
show
remember.
it? I don't know.
Maybe you can't see it. They show the title page.
I don't remember.
Maybe it's indistinct.
But like, so Faulkner, what the surface is, greatest American novelist in history. And then if you go on the other side of that wallpaper, who's the man on the other side of the curtain? He's a drunk and a fraud. Right? Charlie seems like a nice guy, and then on the other side, he's a serial killer and a Nazi. Right? Even the final image of the movie. Actually, I should skip. I'm not going to go to that. But there's a drain, and you go in the drain. You start with something you see every day, a sink, and then you go underneath the surface, seeing shit you're not supposed to see, like the drain pipes, the horn. They go you into the musical instrument. That's not something. There's the surface, the horn, and then in the hole you go. And actually, one of the final images of the film is of the surface of the water, and then the bird plunges below the depth of credits. Yeah. Right. So again and again, Barton is presented with a covering of some kind, and he chooses to go on the other side of that, and the things on the other side are bad. They're bad shit. It's the truth that he's searching for turns out every time to be like pretty ugly. And he's never like, yay, I'm glad I know what that is.
And this goes to, like, there's this idea in Nietzsche, which is that truth might not be the thing that you really want. That when you uncover things, it's like that's nihilism, right? There's really nothing there. It's to your peril. Yeah. To search, and what we want is more and more interesting artifice. But because we have this drive to truth, we're constantly going to be breaking through the artifice. We're going to constantly start disbelieving in the things that we believed in. And I think, one of the questions that a movie like this asks is like, what happens when you can no longer suspend disbelief in anything? Yeah.
And actually, if I can add, the thing you're saying about Nietzsche, I always think of this joke that Henry David Thoreau tells. I think it may be the very beginning of Walden, or maybe it's the beginning of the conclusion of Walden. But he tells a joke about a man with a horse comes to a bog, and there's a boy there. And he says to the boy, does this bog have a hard bottom? And the boy says, yes, it does. So the guy takes the horse into the thing, and he ends up sinking all the way up to his neck. And he looks back at the kid and he says, I thought you said that this swamp had a hard bottom. And the kid said, it does. You're not halfway to it yet. And like that, I think that's really crucial for Barton Fink. Like there is a hard bottom. There is truth, but it's going to fucking kill you. It's not good for you. It's not healthy for you. Like this is not helping you out.
You want to live in the picture with the girl looking at the ocean.
Yeah.
Right. You don't actually want to be on the beach with this box.
Right, so the box.
The box. Yeah. Well, before I get to the box, the other crucial thing about this film is I know, I feel it's like a 7, right? That's all I can hear.
Is that
right. The box?
Is 7? I guess that's I guess I doubt it's like a direct reference, but I mean, there's one thing that it seems to be most likely in the box.
Yes.
That is a lot like what winds up being in the box.
But again, think about likelihood in a movie where Lipnick kisses the soles of his feet when he refuses to tell him what the project is about. When like Charlie turns out to be a Nazi and a madman, and I gave you the list already, right? But there's you're constantly surprised, always. Like Lipnick fires Lou Breeze, and then Lou Breeze is just back to work, like for that final scene with Lipnick.
He's probably fired him dozens of times.
But like whatever you expect it's not going to go that way. Like every time Barton thinks he knows what's going to happen, every time we think we know what's going to happen next. He writes his masterpiece, and they hate it. Right? He broke Geisler's heart.
You mentioned the scene where Audrey turns up dead, but just like, how does that start with him swatting the mosquito? And you think, oh, is she going to wake up and be mad? Or like, what? Well, no, we do not expect like all the blood from the mosquito and then all of the other fucking blood.
A lot of the questions that come up through the movie, a lot of the points in the movie where it asks like, well, what do you think happened? I felt like I was able to, at least for myself, think of something concretely that made sense for me. I really could not answer that question for myself with Audrey. Like because there's really three possibilities, right? And where it's like either Barton did it, or she killed herself, or John Goodman or Charlie snuck in and did it. And I could not answer that question for myself in a way.
Yeah. So, sorry, Audrey's death is also part of, again, this is my third and final list here, basically. But it's part of a trend in the movie of radical ambiguity. So just like, and one of my favorite, the favorite example is that when he hears John Goodman making noise before he meets Charlie, but he hears a noise, and it is impossible to tell whether it is crying or laughter. And to be extra crazy, there are two sentences that Charlie says when he comes over to Barton's room that indicate both. At one point, he's like, oh, a little too much with the late night revelry. Sorry about that, pal. But then earlier he was like, and I'm a pretty successful salesman, despite what you might have heard tonight. Like, one of those sentences indicates that he was crying, and the other one that he was laughing, and they don't resolve it. And then the neighbors in the next room, who you never see, it's very unclear whether that is sex noises or violence noises. Like, I can't tell. And Audrey's death seems impossible, right? That somehow while Barton is sleeping, she is killed in such a way that when he touches her, all the blood comes spilling out of her. But like, what? It doesn't make any sense. Did Charlie snuck in the room? And like, no.
And the whole thing about his mosquito bites, and they keep saying there aren't any mosquitoes in California.
This is Los Angeles. Mosquitoes are in a swamp. Los Angeles is a desert. But even all right.
No, and also like the fact, like when he hits the mosquito and all the blood comes out. To my reading of that was also like, this is something that must have just happened.
Yeah,
like this, her death must have just had, like, there's no way that this happened several hours ago, because then she would have already bled out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is
it
really
almost feels as if hitting the mosquito is what does it.
Well, yeah,
right? That's
because
how
that's
it
dream
presents
logic. That's dream logic, right? When you hit a mosquito, you expect to see blood, and here comes the blood. It's right. That's direct dream logic. But like, it's also, but these. Actually, I'm going to go right into my main point. But like all of these ambiguities, right? They culminate in the end of the movie, where, by the way, right before the last scene, it's unclear if if Barton's whole family has been beheaded. Like he's called. I love that he also asks the operator for Uncle Morty. Like, it's not the operator's Uncle Morty. And this is the thing, is Barton's whole thing has been delving. Oh, actually, I'm going to do a little sidebar before I get to that. But like one of the things that comes up is this idea of art and film as an escape. Because that's one of the things we think about movies, like the sort of like popular pictures or whatever, being about, I just want to escape from reality for a little while and be in a movie theater. But like, interestingly, William Faulkner says that I keep calling, sorry, he's always Faulkner in my head.
That's fine. I've already forgotten the character's name.
Yeah,
it's fine.
That's fine. Call him Faulkner. We called Charlie John Goodman a bunch of times. So why not?
But Faulkner's point is that he drinks to escape, and Barton talks about it damages your gift, and Faulkner actually says truth is something doesn't bear scrutiny. Like, I don't want to look at the truth, and I drink alcohol to escape. And Charlie's whole deal as a serial killer is that people are in pain, people are hurting, and I'm going to help them escape this terrible world by cutting their head off.
But at the same time, there's an intimation that he's actually getting revenge on Barton for like calling the concierge on him or whatever.
Yeah. And then in one of those classic reversals, as soon as Barton says I'm sorry, he's like, that's okay, right? Like, it's never what you think it's going to be.
But that part sort of makes sense, like in the context of the larger film, like, oh yeah, he's invading John Goodman's world. You know, he's this guy from New York who thinks he understands the common man. And what is and what happens at the end? John Goodman goes back into his burning room. Like, I live here. Yeah. I live in this world of wrestling films, and you know,
after going to Barton's world and going and possibly murdering his family and coming back.
And that's another ambiguity of the film, is we never see inside Charlie's apartment. Because he says, "Oh, my room's a mess. You don't want to go in there." Anything could be going on in there. I have no idea. All of these ambiguities culminate in the end of the movie because Barton doesn't listen, and I think hilariously, it's really funny to me that the reason he doesn't listen is because he's too busy shouting theories about the common man, prevent him from listening to the common man. And I think there's a lesson in there about how our theories about the movie Barton Fink, our theories about David Lynch, prevent us from actually watching the movie that he made because we want to have a theory about it to make it make sense. And this is why at the end of the film, there's two really crucial things that happen, which is Barton makes the script and it's rejected. And they say, we don't want to watch a guy wrestling with his soul. And he says, I wanted to show you something beautiful. But I think Barton Fink is the movie about a guy wrestling with his soul, and John Goodman in the burning building feels like hell and that girl feels like heaven. And it's something beautiful. But our theories about the movie prevent us from actually seeing the movie that the Coen brothers made. And that's why the big ending of the movie is that he goes out on the beach and the beautiful woman comes over and she says, the question that's on all of our minds, what's in the box? And he says, I don't know. And then she says, isn't it yours? And he says his last line in the movie, he says one more, but he says, I don't know. Like, it's that. And
that's after John Goodman says, I lied. Yeah. It's not mine.
It's not mine. Right. So that, like, to me, this is a movie about a guy who learns to just live with the fucking mystery. He could open the box and find out what's in there, but every time he tries to go on the other side of a surface, it's bad underneath. And in the end, he doesn't open the box to find out what's inside, because how did that go for him the whole fucking movie? And it's funny to me when you get people who watch the movie and they desperately want to know, what does Barton Fink the movie mean? Solve it for me. But like that, the whole character's journey is learning to just live with, I don't know.
And especially if you look at it in the context of the Coen brothers' filmography up until that point, where their movies up until then, like Raising Arizona and Miller's Crossing and stuff, were all these like very like plot dense, like complicated movies with a very clear plot that maybe still had some strangeness to them and some surreal moments, but there was nothing. I mean, there was nothing ambiguous in Miller's Crossing. It's not the right? Like, I mean, it lays everything out with you, and it felt a bit like them also maturing a bit as artists and like learning the power that is in that ambiguity, and learning like it doesn't have to be this like hyper complex, like either like weird redneck screwball comedy kind of thing like Raising Arizona, or this like hyper dense film noir. And it kind of it was making me like, thinking about this movie and thinking about Miller's Crossing made me think a lot about The Big Lebowski, which would come 8 years later, which is the ultimate synthesis of their weird surrealistic ambiguity and a super hyper dense complex plot, because The Big Lebowski is a movie that has an incredibly dense and complicated story, and is also just fucking about some guy who doesn't know what's going on, and that's just sort of floating through life like a dream.
Yeah, and also notice Lebowski would be able to live with the mystery, man. Like, abide.
Lebowski doesn't want to know. He really doesn't, and not in a malicious,
in a healthy way.
Lebowski is very comfortable just sitting in his house.
The quest after solving stuff gets into trouble, and Lebowski's he just abides. That's what Fink learns to do in this movie, is just to abide. He's going to sit on the beach and look at the waves and just abide.
The thing with like the plot of Lebowski, like you said, Evan, it's a very complicated plot, a lot of ins, a lot of outs, as they would say in the movie. In Barton Fink, nothing that actually happens, like anything concrete that unambiguously happens, really matters.
It's actually a very simple story, yeah.
Yeah. Like the whole thing where him writing a script doesn't really matter. The script isn't going anywhere. Him going to Hollywood, it's all about him wrestling with his soul. And it's about the characters and their internal, really just Barton's internal, bullshit. We all have tons of it.
In the immortal words of Carl from Aqua Teen Hunger Force, it doesn't matter.
None of this matters.
None of this matters.
None of this matters.
That's a good Carl. This movie was also it was very resonant for me on a personal level, because something I have been trying to deal with in therapy lately, and also in retrospect in my entire 36 years on this earth so far.
That's therapy.
I am terrible at compartmentalizing. Like, I don't really understand how other people do it. Like, I can do it to some degree. Like, just like you can't actually function in the world if you can't kind of do it. But like, in the since fucking COVID hit, and in the last 4 years, as we entered the final stages of, hopefully not society in general, but the final stages certainly of something, it's become much more difficult. Like, everybody is having a hard time during COVID, certainly, but like I know some people, I see people in my everyday life who seem to be able to stop thinking about it for like 5 seconds, and I just can't. And when William Faulkner is like, you don't want to know, you don't want the truth, you don't want to get too deep in there, you don't want to think about it, I was just like, oh my God, like, this has been, because like my therapist keeps being like, look, like, I'm not saying, she's like, look, it's not like it's unreasonable for you to feel these things, but she's like, you can't do anything about it. Yeah. Like, there are things that you can, some things you can do, but then there is a point at which you have to accept that you just have to live your life and shit's going on. And then, I mean, there was a lot more, she wasn't just like, yeah, go fucking figure it out. I mean, it's like, she's a cognitive behavioralist. We have a whole plan going on, but it's still like, this movie, because he also seems like a guy who, like, not necessarily that I saw myself in Barton, but like, he cannot, I don't know. Not that the compartmentalization was about him specifically, but this movie, something about this movie made me feel something resonant with that I can't quite articulate.
As Geoff was saying,
I think your point is made well enough, and even though you can't quite find the words you're looking for, I think that's very appropriate with the movie. That the meaning is very deep, and you can feel it, but you can't quite explain it. So no, I completely dig. But just for me, I dig what you're saying, Evan, a lot. But I'm sorry, Ben, I cut you off. What do you say?
No, I mean, as Geoff was just saying about Lebowski, right? Like, he can just abide. Right, he can just kind of like deal with what's going on and not have to.
Everyone around him is like, Lebowski, all of this shit, and he's like.
And I'm really glad that you brought up this like larger, right? The therapy thing I think is really important, because there is like Barton Fink is like a much bigger. It's not just about this one guy, right? These are like large kind of like mental cosmic issues. But like, one of the things I think, like, the image of someone who demands an interpretation. There is one person in the movie who absolutely demands an interpretation, and it's Nebuchadnezzar.
I was going to ask about Nebuchadnezzar.
Faulkner, it's not just the spaceship from the Matrix. The Faulkner character,
which also puzzles me.
I know.
Now,
I
like, when I was like, Nebuchadnezzar. Why would the heroes have a ship?
I think it just is a word that sounds cool.
Yeah,
that's all. I think that's as much.
Cool.
Yeah.
I still really like The Matrix whenever I see it, but it screams in every way, this is going to sound really cool exactly when it comes out, and it does.
I will argue with anybody that I think the Wachowskis are geniuses on a similar level to the Coen brothers, but subtlety is not... There is no subtle, like, Sense8 is one of my favorite things ever made.
Sense8
It's
so
incredible.
Much. It's X-Men plus bisexual polyamory, and I am fucking here for it. There's a word for that, and it's called utopia.
It is. It truly is. Sense8 is truly a show about how good we could be.
Yeah.
And it is also the least subtle thing. Like there is no concept
subtlety.
of if there's a thing that is something is supposed to represent, they'll just fucking say it to you, and then everyone will have sex and you'll be fine with it.
By the way, I've been wanting Evan and Jeff to meet each other for a really long time.
Yeah, I do.
Really
this is wonderful.
It was a really cool
really
encapsulation of what I hoped would happen.
Like Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar is the name of Faulkner's book. Obviously, a reference to like Absalom, which is also named after a Bible, name. But like the other thing about Nebuchadnezzar is Nebuchadnezzar says, "Interpret my dream for me, and if you fail to do it, I will chop you into little pieces." Like that is the image of someone who demands the violence of demanding an interpretation, the willingness to kill to get one, right? And this is what we're trying to avoid. And I'm going to make I have like one more point to make, and I think I will have said my piece. But like this is really tied into Judaism. Like this is very, very tied into Judaism, which is that like I feel like there's like two of the big competing theories about how to deal with. I mean, there's a lot of them, but like two of the big ones that people go for is like hedonism, just like have as much fun as you fucking can before you die, and then like there's a Christianity thing where it's like no, it's not about your personal pleasure. Why don't you try putting yourself aside and sacrifice and like do the right thing for other people? But if you actually look at Christianity, and the Coen brothers make this point in A Serious Man, which is maybe the most Jewish movie ever made, and I love it so much. I
need to see that one. I've heard a lot.
It's amazing. But they make this point, which is that actually, if you think about it, Christianity is just a different form of hedonism, because Christianity says, make your sacrifices here, and you will be rewarded with pleasure in heaven. So it's really just like it's like those teenagers who are told by pastors that the longer they wait to have sex before marriage, it'll be so much better. So it's like delayed pleasure, but it's hedonism is immediate pleasure and Christianity is delayed pleasure. Judaism, though, there's no heaven, there's no hell. God commands you to do things, and you do them not because it's going to get you into heaven, but because you were fucking commanded to do it. And so there's like a radical irrationality in Judaism where they're commandments. They're just things you've been commanded to do. And that's why the Torah, the God in the Torah, is like, hey, Abraham, fucking kill your kid right now. No, there's no reason. Just fucking do it. And then, right, or Job, we're gonna fuck with this guy. And then when Job is like, can you please make this make sense? He's like, shut the fuck up. I made the fucking whale. You didn't make a whale. Go eat a dick. So like,
that was in the original Greek too, and it sounds so much better than in English. Yeah,
which is so weird because there is this like tradition of interpretation and trying to understand the Torah that's in the Talmud and that kind of stuff. So it's just this like it's something essentially irrational that part of the commandment is to continuously try to make sense of it,
because all of
which really encapsulates being Jewish.
All of the
all
of the sort of theories and readings in the Talmud is about trying to make sense out of what is fundamentally radical God. Because the Christians, like if you're a Protestant, right? My mother has like her own personal Jesus that and Jesus like walks with you on the beach, and that was when I carried you and your footprints in this shit, right? But in Judaism, like God isn't like a nice guy that walks with you. He's like a pillar of fire, or he's a fucking tornado. And Moses goes to get the tablets, and God is like, you can't look at my face. Like you don't get to see me. And in fact, one of the least talked about parts of the Torah is God attempts to murder Moses for no fucking reason. And there's a little footnote where they try to explain it. It is unexplainable. God swoops down in the middle of the night on the road and tries to kill Moses. And his wife circumcises somebody, his son, him. The Hebrew is ambiguous there, but like the point, and then he just goes away. So like there's like a radical unknowability that is built into Judaism, and I think it's built into Barton Fink and his Jewish experience. That's why it's really important that right at the beginning of the movie, the two characters he meets for dinner are like Poppy and something St. Clair. Like they're very waspy. And he is the Jewish outsider, because his relationship to like Judaism is like there's an irrational, unknowable core at the center of it, And I really think that's heavily reflected by Barton Fink. And it's why Barton Fink feels so much like Kafka, because it's essentially a commentary on the Torah in the same way that Kafka is a commentary on the Torah.
I don't think we're gonna be able to do anything better than that. I will say,
good movie.
Yeah,
I liked it.
Fantastic movie. I will say,
if you like
big men in tights, big physically and mentally, but especially physically.
I will say, Geoff, you should. Sometimes we talk about how would this podcast work. Like, if I needed to take a break for a while or something, how would we have? Well, like, who would?
I had this thought in the shower myself today.
And Doc be able to, because I think that you would get a lot. I have been endlessly fascinated by how much more there is to wrestling than I ever gave it credit for, and now I really kind of do feel like, in some ways, it is the only legitimate avant-garde theater that ever exists, because it is the only form of storytelling that exists where you are really not supposed to know how much of it is real and how much of it is fake, and you'll never know, and you'll never have any idea.
Can I bring that to the movie? Because that was a point that I wanted to make and forgot about, in that people very much have preconceived notions about what wrestling is, and this is not a new thing. At the time the movie's supposed to take place, they did, and those preconceived notions are very similar to the ones they're supposed to have today. Barton, I'm sure, not knowing anything about wrestling, probably thought he knew what wrestling was, and then when he saw the clips of the actors trying to play wrestling, it probably didn't clarify anything. But the thing he didn't do, which so many people don't do, is he didn't just go see some wrestling matches, because it's so easy just to do, and it's so illuminating if you just actually watch it for a change, instead of trying to tell people what it is, even though you've never actually watched a match before.
He doesn't listen.
And you find out,
and
he doesn't listen. You find out that not only is there a lot more to it, but there also really isn't.
As the studio head,
those are themes in this movie.
Indeed, and in this podcast.
Yes.
And as the studio head puts it, there's plenty of poetry right inside that ring.
It's true, that's the deal.
And I also, something that I had, something that Barton should have realized, because the issue that I noticed with wrestling right off the bat, by episode 6 of doing this, was that one of the things that makes it hard to get into wrestling is that somebody has to explain it to you. Somebody has to come. Somebody who knows what they're talking about has to tell you about the things that make it interesting, or at least in my experience, because I feel like if you just sit there and watch it in a vacuum, you might pick up on some things here and there, but you're never going to actually. To me, what makes wrestling so interesting is learning about the mechanics of how it works, and then seeing how those mechanics play out. And I feel like you need to have somebody come and tell you, well, here's where it's quote-unquote real, and here's where it's quote-unquote fake, and here's where it's written, and here's where it's improvised, and here's what's authentic, and here's where they're just fucking lying to you, and, here's the parts that's sort of like acting, and here's the parts where they're not acting. And that's, once you know that, then wrestling gets far more interesting, but somebody has to tell it to you.
And if you don't have that guidance, you have to want to watch it. So I very often, when I'm watching wrestling in my apartment and my roommates who don't watch it or whatever, they walk past and they can't really look at it. They don't, they don't want to. And so if you're not if you don't, Evan had this, strange masochistic desire to do this podcast and get shown wrestling and get taught from our perspective what we like about it. I'm
a real entertainer. I'm willing to sacrifice everything to bring laughter to the 25 people.
And there's a huge highbrow equivalent to that too, which is, I'm sure you guys have seen people who were dragged by their partners or parents or whatever to a museum, an art museum, and they walk around and they don't know what to do. There's a painting, they're definitely looking at an image. But part of the problem is, and again, like Barton Fink, they imagine everybody else is doing something. When you just like Barton, you just need to kind of abide with it. But actually, I'm gonna quote Kung Fu Panda, which is a very fucking wise movie. But in Kung Fu Panda, they're going after the big martial arts secret, and then they get it, and it's fucking blank. And then he quits martial arts, and he goes home, and he's now going to give up martial arts and work in the soup kitchen with his dad. And his dad tells him the secret ingredient of the soup, and he says the secret ingredient is nothing. It's just that people think there's a secret ingredient, and so they think it tastes better. And then he tells them, and the big revelation in Kung Fu Panda is the secret is there is no secret. Like you got to just be with it, man. Like everybody else isn't in on something. You just gotta abide, like the dude.
So one of the most impactful moments of my life artistically, I don't really know anything about visual art, right? I tend to not that I'm like, fuck paintings, but I don't really know much about that sort of art. And I had a friend who was trying to get a job as a tour guide at the Guggenheim years ago. And she reached out to me and she was like, hey, they're doing this thing. They have this exhibit up now that it's basically like the history of modern painting. Like it starts with Jackson Pollock and then goes on. You should come with me. And she was like, oh, I'm trying to give a practice tour so I can tell them that when I go and interview. And I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds awesome. And as we're going around, one of the paint she mentioned, she was like, oh yeah, there's this guy, and then there's Mark Rothko. And Mark Rothko was amazing. And it was a name I'd heard.
Love Rothko.
Yeah,
and it was also in my head at the time. Rothko was an example of like why I felt like I didn't get modern art, because I would open up art books and look at pictures of his paintings and be like, it's stripes. I don't fucking get it. What is? Yeah. I don't understand what's going on here. And just not even necessarily like in a shitting on it kind of way, but I was like, I guess I don't understand this because I don't see it. And when we actually got to the painting, and she pointed to a point on the floor, and she was like, stand here, stand this distance from it, and empty your mind and just look at it. And I basically started weeping in the middle of the Guggenheim because I can't really explain it. I can't explain what the difference was.
Yeah.
I was seeing the same thing I had seen it, but just being there and being in front of it, I just changed me.
Yeah, and everybody knows.
So we need to take you
between looking at a painting and seeing art.
So we need to take you to see some live wrestling. Is what
yeah,
you're saying.
But
yes,
this is
yeah.
This is something
once
now.
There's more of it.
This is something now I think that everybody understands, because previous to COVID, right? I'm sure a lot of people are like, they see the painting in the book and they're like, I don't get it. But if you see it in real life, it's different. And people, I'm sure, are like, it's probably not. It's just bigger. This is dumb. But now that we're doing everything on Zoom, something's missed. There's an indescribable something that is missing. And that something, the difference between hanging out in real life and hanging out on Zoom is the same difference between the art book and actually standing there in front of the fucking painting. And everybody has experienced this now. We all know something is fucking wrong with communicating in this, with living in this way. And for me, it's been the difference between online teaching and in-person teaching. I am Norma Desmond, and the talkies ruined movies, and I'm right. It's this technology, and yeah.
On that note, we're just about out of time, I think.
Thank you for having me.
Geoff,
this has been fantastic. You guys are amazing.
Yeah, Geoff.
Thanks so much for coming.
Do you want to plug anything?
No, I have nothing. I mean, Google me and follow me on social media. I'm the only person with my first and last name, so that should be real easy.
At GeoffKlock.
Yes, it's Geoff with it's Geoff with a G as in Gnostic, and Klock with a K as in knife, and Geoff has 2 F's like in Philadelphia.
It's high quality spelling right there.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, man, this was fantastic. Open invitation to come back anytime you want, talk about anything you want. And we're gonna have to. We're gonna have to. I've never seen it.
Sounds like a good idea. We'll
yeah.
do that sooner than later. I haven't seen The Wrestler since I saw it in the theaters, and I mean, it was fantastic then, and burned into my mind, of course.
Premium listeners, as always, we cannot thank you enough for your support It really does. It really makes a huge difference. I don't know. Reach out to us as always at ContestingW on Twitter. Let us know what you thought of this. And let us know if there's anything you should cover. Let us know if you went and saw Barton Fink for the first time. You can get it for about
Barton Fink.
Barton Fink.
It's a shame Katie's not on this.
For people that don't know, there's a Simpsons episode where Bart, his friends are going to go see because Bart's a kid, they're going to go see a rated R movie and they're real excited about it, and Bart can't go, and they leave cheering Barton Fink, Barton Fink, Barton Fink, because it's not like that's not. They think the rated R movie is going to be
like
salacious.
We're going to see the Terminator.
Which again, I very much empathized with, having seen it at 7 years old.
And there's a similar Simpsons joke that I love when they get fake IDs and they go see Naked Lunch and they leave and it's like the greatest Simpsons joke is Nelson just says, I can think of exactly 2 things wrong with that title.
When I was in middle school, a friend of mine and I told our parents that we were going to go see I Know What You Did Last Summer. And instead we were like, let's go sneak into Boogie Nights, right? Because it's a hot movie about porno. That is not the core of that movie. That is a dark examination of the human soul.
Yeah.
There's a reason the critics loved that movie, and it wasn't because of the porno.
Yeah. And we totally walked. It was exactly like the Naked Lunch where we just walked out and we were like, that wasn't what I was anticipating. I wish we had seen the stupid fucking horror movie.
Right. I Know What You Did Last Summer, which is at the same time the stupidest and greatest title for a horror movie ever.
This has been Contesting Wrestling. We love you.
Yeah.
Peace.